On August the 24th, 79 AD, a mountain that had not erupted in roughly 700 years killed somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 people in 18 hours. That number is not the remarkable part. The remarkable part is that the mountain gave the city a warning that lasted most of the afternoon, was visible from 18 miles away across the Bay of Naples, and was described in real time by a 17-year-old boy who had never seen a volcano in his life, and who still found it interesting enough to take notes rather than run. Most of the city looked at that warning and decided to stay home. We are going to walk through exactly how that decision played out, minute by minute, and why by the time most people understood what was happening, understanding it no longer helped. This is a video about what your 18 hours in Pompeii actually looked like. Not the postcard version with plaster casts and atmospheric ruins, but the version where you woke up as a cloth merchant or a baker or a wine cellar on what felt like an ordinary Tuesday in August, watched a column of cloud rise over the mountain after lunch, made a series of decisions that each seemed reasonable in the moment, and died before sunrise not from lava, which never reached the city at all, but from something that arrived horizontally, at the speed of a highway car, hot enough to kill you before you had time to understand that you were dying. You are in Pompeii. You have a stall in the Forum. You have lived here your entire life. Your father lived here, and the mountain behind the city has always just been the mountain. And then, at approximately 1 in the afternoon, it stops being that. First, you need to understand what kind of city you are actually living in, because the version in most people's heads, a small provincial Roman town, essentially a tourist site waiting to be discovered, is wrong in almost every detail. Pompeii at the time of the eruption had a population of somewhere between 11,000 and 20,000 people, depending on which archaeologist's housing density estimate you use, and it was one of the most prosperous commercial cities in Campania. It had 2 theaters, an amphitheater with a capacity of 20,000 seats, which for context is larger than many modern sports arenas, at least 35 bakeries operating simultaneously, which the archaeologists know because the millstones and bread ovens have been excavated and counted. 118 bars and taverns, called thermopolia, where you could buy hot food from terracotta containers sunk into stone counters, the Roman equivalent of a fast food counter, and the counters are still there. A forum lined with temples and government buildings, running water delivered by an aqueduct through a network of lead pipes to street fountains and to the private homes of people wealthy enough to afford the tap fee. The city smelled, as Roman cities did, of baking bread and the fuller's vats of urine used to process wool, and of the open drainage channels that ran down the centers of streets, and of the fish sauce called garum that was manufactured in industrial quantities just outside the city walls and exported across the empire in labeled clay amphorae that archaeologists have since found as far away as Britain. Pompeii was not a quiet place. It was a working port city on one of the most commercially active bays in the ancient Mediterranean, and on the morning of August the 24th, it was doing exactly what it did every morning, which is to say, everything, loudly, in the heat. Vesuvius had been giving warnings for days, possibly weeks, and almost none of them were correctly interpreted. Minor earthquakes had rattled the region throughout August. Springs and wells in the area had been behaving strangely, levels dropping, some drying up entirely, which is a reliable precursor to volcanic activity, because the ground deformation that precedes an eruption disrupts the underground water table. The aqueduct that supplied Pompeii's water system had been running at reduced pressure. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist and naval commander based at Misenum on the northwest shore of the bay, had been tracking these disturbances in the notebooks he kept for his encyclopedic natural history. He noted them. He did not know what to make of them because nobody in the Roman world had a framework for interpreting pre-eruptive seismic activity. Vesuvius had last erupted around 1800 BC, roughly 19 centuries before anyone in Pompeii was born. In every living memory, and in every memory anyone could recall hearing about, it had been an inert mountain. A fertile one, in fact. The volcanic soil on its slopes was exceptional for growing grapes, and the wine produced there was considered among the best in Italy. The eruption began at approximately 1 in the afternoon, and it did not begin with an explosion. It began with a sound, a deep crack that people across a wide area reported feeling more in their chests than hearing with their ears, followed immediately by a column of ash and gas punching vertically out of the summit at a velocity that modern volcanologists, studying the deposit layers, have calculated at several hundred meters per second. The column rose to between 20 and 30 kilometers above sea level. To put that number in perspective, commercial aircraft cruise at about 10 to 12 kilometers. The Vesuvius eruption column was 2 to 3 times higher than the altitude at which you fly on a transatlantic flight, and it was rising in real time while you were standing in your forum stall looking up at it. Pliny the Younger was 17 years old at his family's villa in Misenum when he saw the column appear. He later described it in 2 letters to the historian Tacitus that are the only surviving eyewitness account of the eruption, the only reason we know as much as we do about the sequence of events. He wrote that the cloud resembled a pine tree, a tall, straight trunk expanding at the top into branches. What he was describing, without the vocabulary to name it, is what volcanologists now call a Plinian eruption column, named after him specifically. He found it interesting enough to point it out to his uncle. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, found it interesting enough to order a boat made ready so he could sail across the bay for a closer look. Neither of them, at 1 p.m, treated what they were seeing as an emergency requiring immediate evacuation. This tells you something important about what the eruption looked like from the outside in its first hours. It looked like a spectacular natural phenomenon. It did not yet look like what it was. You are standing somewhere in Pompeii when the column appears, and the question of what you do next is the question this entire video is about. Because the answer, it turns out, sorted the living from the dead with a precision that has survived in the archaeological record for nearly 2,000 years. The people who looked at that column and immediately left, gathered their family, grabbed what they could carry, and started walking away from the mountain, survived. The vast majority of Pompeii's population did exactly this. We know because they are not in the ash. The people who stayed, for whatever reason, are the ones the excavations found. By mid-afternoon, pumice and ash are falling on the city. This is the moment when the decision to stay or go became significantly harder to reverse, and it happened gradually enough that the change was difficult to perceive in real time. Pumice is a volcanic rock so full of gas bubbles that it floats in water. The pieces falling on Pompeii in the first hours were roughly the size of walnuts or small fists, falling at a rate that volcanologist Haraldur Sigurdsson's research team later calculated as adding approximately 15 centimeters of accumulated depth per hour. It would have felt and sounded like an extremely heavy hailstorm, except that it did not stop after 5 minutes. It did not stop after 30 minutes. It kept coming continuously for hours. So you go inside. This is what a reasonable person does when rocks are falling from the sky. Inside is shelter. Inside is where your goods and your valuables are. Inside is where you can wait for this extraordinary event to pass. What you do not know, because nobody has told you and there is no precedent from which to reason, is that the pumice is simultaneously accumulating on your roof at the same rate it is accumulating on the street. Roman roofs were built to handle rain, not to handle a continuous deposit of rock. A meter of pumice weighs several hundred kilograms per square meter. Buildings in Pompeii, as in any ancient city, varied enormously in construction quality. Some well-built stone structures, some older buildings with weakened timbers, some cheaply constructed rental properties that had never been tested by anything heavier than a winter rainstorm. By early evening, the weaker roofs are beginning to give way. The archaeological record shows skeletons found in collapsed room interiors, people who died not from the volcanic event directly, but from their own ceilings. They went inside to survive, and the building killed them. The official term for this in the literature is secondary structural collapse. The experience of being underneath it had no official term. Now, if everything I have described so far, the pumice fall, the darkness, the collapsing roofs, sounds survivable with the right precautions, I need you to understand something. We have not yet talked about what actually killed the people whose shapes you have seen in photographs. We have not discussed the thing that arrived in the night and ended the city in a matter of minutes. All of that is still coming, and it moves considerably faster than a roof falling in. By nightfall, the sky is a color that has no name in any normal human experience of darkness. Pliny the Younger, watching from Misenum, described it as unlike any ordinary night, not the gradual deepening of dusk, not even the dark of a moonless, overcast sky, but a total and absolute absence of light, as if, in his words, every lamp in a sealed room had been extinguished simultaneously. The ash column above the city was blocking all starlight. The fires visible on the mountainside, which Pliny the Elder had reassured the people sheltering with him at Stabii were nothing more than abandoned farmhouses burning, were actually collapse events within the eruption column, as sections of it fell back to earth. The elder Pliny told people not to worry. He was, as it turned out, wrong about this. You are moving through that darkness, if you are still moving at all, through pumice that is now accumulated to knee depth and shifts like loose gravel under every step. The road out of the Herculaneum Gate that was accessible at 1 in the afternoon is now a different landscape. The ground level has risen by a meter. Doorways that were at street level are now half buried. The familiar landmarks of a city you have known your entire life are altered enough in the dark that navigation is genuinely difficult. People are falling into the drainage channels they can no longer see. People are discarding valuables they picked up earlier because the weight is slowing them down. And people are making what will turn out to be the last meaningful decision of their lives, which is to find a solid-looking structure, get inside it, and wait for dawn. The group of 38 people found in the Garden of the Fugitives had already made one adjustment to their strategy. They were not inside a building. They had apparently understood, or observed, that buildings were collapsing, and they had moved to an open garden space away from any roof. 13 of their casts, including those of children, are among the most famous images from Pompeii. They were found together, huddled, in the open air. The open air did not help them. What was coming did not come from the rooftops. Now we need to talk about what killed the people of Pompeii. And the answer requires understanding a term that did not exist when the event happened, and that still, even explained carefully, does not fully prepare you for the thing it describes. A pyroclastic surge is a ground-hugging avalanche of superheated gas, ash, and pulverized rock that travels outward from a volcanic vent along the surface of the earth. Not down a channel, not along a predictable path, outward, in all directions simultaneously, following the terrain, filling every space available to it. The speeds recorded in comparable modern eruptions run between 100 and 300 kilometers per hour. The temperatures at the leading edge have been measured at between 200 and 500 degrees Celsius. For comparison, a domestic oven set to its maximum temperature runs at around 250 degrees. The surge that reached Pompeii was, at minimum, as hot as the inside of a fully preheated oven, moving at the speed of a car on a motorway, and it covered the distance from the volcano to the city in a matter of minutes. 6 pyroclastic surges struck the Pompeii region between approximately 1 in the morning and 8 in the morning of August the 25th. The first 2 surges destroyed Herculaneum, 4 kilometers closer to the summit than Pompeii. The residents of Herculaneum, who had sheltered in the boat chambers on the beach and whose skeletons were excavated in the 1980s, still in the positions they occupied when the surge arrived, died so quickly that their skulls show evidence of instantaneous vaporization of brain tissue. This is not a detail that appears in the tourist brochures. It is a detail that tells you the precise nature of what was moving through the night toward Pompeii. The third surge reached the walls of Pompeii. Bioarchaeologist Estelle Lazare, whose comprehensive analysis of skeletal remains from the site remains the most thorough study conducted, documented a pattern consistent across the bodies from this phase of the eruption. The pugilistic posture, arms drawn upward and inward, fists clenched, legs contracted. This is not a fighting position, and it is not a defensive one. It is the signature of sudden, extreme heat, the large muscle groups contracting simultaneously as the proteins in them denature at temperatures the body was never designed to survive. The people of Pompeii in the path of the surges did not suffocate slowly, did not have time to call out or reach for one another or do anything at all. The transition from alive to dead took seconds. Their bodies, locked into whatever position they occupied at that moment, were sealed by the ash that followed, and waited in that position for 1,784 years, until Fiorelli poured plaster into the void and gave them back their shapes. Let me give you the numbers that frame everything you have just heard. Of the 11,000 to 20,000 people in Pompeii on the morning of August the 24th, between 2,000 and 4,000 died, meaning the survival rate was somewhere between 70 and 80%, meaning that the mountain, which killed thousands of people, also gave the majority of them enough time and warning to get out. The death toll at Pompeii and Herculaneum combined, including the smaller settlements of Stabii and Oplantis, also destroyed in the eruption, is now estimated at between 3,500 and 4,000, though many historians believe even these revised figures undercount the total because the ash preserved bodies selectively, and many victims were never found, absorbed into the landscape in a way that left no recoverable trace. The often repeated image of Pompeii as a city caught entirely by surprise, its citizens frozen in the middle of ordinary life without a moment's warning, is not accurate. The warning lasted approximately 12 hours from the appearance of the column to the arrival of the first fatal surge. What the evidence shows instead is a city that had 12 hours to respond to an event it had no framework for understanding, in which each individual hour still felt potentially survivable, in which the decisions that proved fatal were each locally reasonable, and in which the gap between a decision that saved your life and one that ended it was often nothing more than whether you treated the column at 1 PM as sufficient reason to leave without waiting to see what it would do next. Pliny the Elder crossed the bay to help. He beached at Stabii, spent the night reassuring the terrified household sheltering there, remarked that the fires on the mountain were probably nothing serious, ate dinner, and died on the beach the following morning, most likely from cardiovascular collapse brought on by the concentration of sulfurous gas in the air, combined with a heart condition his nephew had noted before the eruption began. He was 55 years old. His nephew stayed home, took notes in the careful, methodical style his uncle had taught him, and wrote 2 letters to Tacitus that are the only eyewitness account of the eruption that survives. The difference between them was not courage versus cowardice. It was a boat, a heart condition, and a 17-year-old who decided that observation from a safe distance was more valuable than proximity. There is one more detail that took the longest to establish, and that still carries the power to reframe the entire event. The casts you have seen, the man covering his face, the family group, the dog on its chain, were made by Giuseppe Fiorelli beginning in 1863 by pouring liquid plaster into the hollows left in the compacted ash after the organic material inside had decomposed over 18 centuries. The technique has since been refined. Modern excavators use clear resin instead of plaster, which allows CT scanning of the skeletal remains preserved inside. Those scans have produced findings that the plaster casts alone could not. The bones inside the casts show no signs of prolonged heat exposure, no evidence of the gradual thermal damage that accumulates over minutes or hours. What the bones show is consistent with death that was instantaneous by the standards of what bone tissue records. The people in those casts did not suffer a slow end. The surge reached them, and then they were in a different category of existence. And the category they moved into lasted until an Italian archaeologist with a bag of plaster found the space they had left behind. You were a cloth merchant. You had a stall in the Forum and a house 3 streets back, and a life that was, by the standards of a prosperous Roman trading city, reasonably good. The mountain gave you the afternoon to leave. Maybe you looked at the column and thought it would pass. Maybe you had goods you couldn't abandon. Maybe you went inside when the pumice started falling and the roof held and it seemed like the right call. Maybe you made it to the garden when you realized the buildings weren't safe and you huddled there with 37 other people who had reached the same conclusion by the same logic, and you waited for the sun to come up. The sun came up. You were not there to see it, and the shape of the last second of your life waited in the ash of the garden for 19 centuries until someone came along with plaster and showed the rest of the world what staying had looked like.